Hello, Michael, and welcome. I'm so delighted to join with you today to learn a little bit about the process of the Ball-Paylore House Commission, which you're doing for the Mini Time Machine Museum this year. And we're really excited to have you involved in this project with us. And our guests are going to enjoy hearing about how you go about making something as complex as a house and all the interior pieces. So I wanted to start by asking you at the very beginning, can you share with us how you get a project like this off the ground? How do you get started on something like this?
Well, every project's different, but this one started off in a really terrific way because I was able to first see a lot of pictures of the home and get a feel for it, um, which was fantastic because it has been pretty well documented, both interior and exterior. But then the real cherry on top was when I got to spend 2 evenings, 2 days and evenings in the Ball-Paylor home in the actual residence, and that was just that's the kind of access that one rarely gets. Sometimes, many times, these places we're documenting are long gone. They don't exist anymore. They've been torn down or repurposed, or maybe they're a private residence or office building that you don't have access to. But here to actually be able to spend time in the space was invaluable. It really, it gave me a chance to review details and some of the obvious architectural things, but then it also gave me a wonderful feeling for the space, the vibe, just how it felt to live in this home.
So as you begin the project, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face in terms of trying to bring this to life and bring the design to life? And are there some solutions that you have to come up with in order to avoid problems down the line?
Yes. Well, good question. I think one of the first things really we wanted to establish was um, what scale to produce the miniature in, because we do have our choice. So we could do pretty much anything. There are some norms in the field in terms of how scale models are usually done. Um, so working with just the blueprints initially, I I made a determination of the footprint of the overall structure, and that told me that doing it in the typical dollhouse scale of 1 inch to the foot or 1/12 scale, that scale would produce a miniature that would be too large for what we wanted for the museum. So I stepped it down and halved that and took it down to 1/2 inch scale, where 1/2 of an inch equals 1 foot in reality. And that produced a miniature that seemed like it would fit in comfortably within the confines of your museum environment. It gave us a footprint and eventual finished piece size of about 3 feet by 3 feet. That's real feet for what would eventually turn out to be the platform for the miniature in the museum. So that was the first big step. And then after coming back and visited the residence, I began to and observed many things there from a personal level. I went ahead and created this foam core study model that you see to my right, and this helped me visualize the piece in 3 dimensions and verify that indeed this was a good working scale for us, and it wouldn't be so small that things would get lost, um, or not have the impact we want in the museum. There were also some technical issues to work out in this first phase as well. I tried to build this maquette, or this foam study model, as accurately as possible, because in my experience, we strive to make it as perfect as possible, and sometimes, invariably, as the process migrates, things can happen, and usually it's not going to get more accurate. it's going to get less accurate. So I try to start at the most detailed and accurate place I can, to try to maintain that level of precision and accuracy throughout the whole project.
So what are some of the particular things that you hope to learn from the paper model? Can you give us some specifics?
Well, yes, since this model is going to feature not only an accurate exterior presentation, but also a complete interior with all the wall surfaces and lighting and ceiling and built-in furniture, I wanted to make sure that we would be able to appreciate that in the finished miniature. So that got me thinking about, well, okay, how do we do that in the actual finished piece? Because as you can see, that by nature, this is a very low profile home. The ceilings are low. The whole piece is very uh, wide and low, very almost like prairie style in a way. Um, and it was done that way to accommodate the original consignees, Ms. Ball and Ms. Paylor. So so there was, so peering down and looking at inside wasn't so much of an option. So I started in my head to try to come up with some ideas as to how to expose the interior. And that led me to this idea of making the roof removable. Now, this piece is eventually going to be under an acrylic dome or cover in the museum. So, so I got to thinking about, well, how can I make this roof? How can I raise the roof on this place, literally, and but making it possible to do that from outside of the enclosure, so that every time someone wanted to see the interior, they wouldn't have to remove this huge plexiglass top from the case to go ahead and see what the inside looked like. So having this removable roof on the maquette, and I'll show you here. These, by the way, are the solar shades that rotate around the patio. That was a very clever part of this design, but I'll get back to that. But making the roof separate here gave me the opportunity, first, to go ahead and visualize the interior space breakdown, and then to think about how I might make access to the interior doable with moving parts in the model. You know, I'm still working with this concept, but the roof could potentially pivot up, or the roof could perhaps raise up on its center and be lifted up this way to expose the inside of the model. I'm kind of leaning towards the latter right now, where the roof will be raised up on a cam that will be accessible from outside the case. So you'll essentially be able to turn a crank and the roof will raise up and you can see the inside. Turn the crank the other way, the roof comes down. Because I think making an either or out of it, where we just show the roof off or the roof on, doesn't really tell the whole story. I think you have to show both in this case. And that's because the piece is so interesting, both in its external configuration and the way the interior is laid out.
I think it's a really good point. In looking at that, I agree with you. I think elevating it vertically, the second option is probably a better option. How detailed do you need to be with the paper model? So for example, are you going to create some of the furniture in paper as well? Some of the built-ins, or do you go that far? Or is it more kind of the broad vision for the house when you're doing it in the paper phase?
That's a good question. In this case, it's more of the big picture. So I doubt that I will do. I'm going to get into some of the countertops, I think, in the kitchen to be able to visualize that space a little bit better. I may even put in the bathroom, just a block to indicate where the bathroom cabinetry and countertops are, and maybe a very basic suggestion of where the built-ins are. Um, it's not a must at this point, but as the process develops, it may be something where I go back and say, well, yeah, let's take another look at this, or let's just verify that this is correct, because already in the process, I discovered some areas where I made a miscalculation in the math and had to rebuild some things, but this is the place to do it. This is the place to discover the mistakes, because they happen. So that's another great value of doing this type of model.
I just had a thought. I was thinking about the fact that you do a lot of mid-century modern furnishings, and I wondered if you had done any of the furnishings that are in this house in previous projects. And then I also had a thought. I know that you generally do your furniture in 1/12 scale. If you have done them before and you now have to reduce them to the half-inch scale, are there adaptations that you're going to have to make to the design, or can you pretty much just recreate it a little bit smaller?
Well, actually, reproducing the pieces, like you say, as you say, I'm often working in 1/12 scale, and especially with my mid-century modern pieces. But I really have to start from scratch in terms of creating the miniatures in 1/24 scale, half-inch scale. I do have lots of reference, for these types of furniture. So that's a big part of the process. And so a lot of that's done. But everything else is kind of like starting from scratch. There's not too much that's transferable except for, what's in my head, what processes have worked before. And and that shouldn't be discounted. There's a lot of research and development that went into figuring out how to make those things in the first place. But in terms of the actual fabrication, this is it's a whole separate kind of project.
Mhm. I imagine you have to make new jigs and that kind of thing for the various pieces that you're going to recreate. And then, yeah, and then the fabrics might be different for the couch in terms of their weight or their texture. Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah, taking all those things into account. Um, yeah, in the furniture and the brickwork and the finish on the concrete floors, everything's got to look right for this scale of miniature, And sometimes too, that's where it's not always about exactly recreating a, a, a replica in that scale. Part of it is capturing the feeling and the mood and the aura of of that of that space. For instance, there's a concrete floor in this building, and it's really charming because the concrete floor on the interior is all polished. But that same concrete floor extends right from the interior of the piece out through the glass and onto the outside patio. But there's a textural difference. The concrete is not polished out there. It's more of a raw concrete finish with no gloss or shine. So capturing those kind of things, it's more of a it's more of a judgment call. It's not necessarily duplicating exactly what's there, but it's more about capturing the feeling of it.
mhm. So do you use real world materials? Like, will you use some sort of concrete for that flooring and the patio flooring? Or will you use a different kind of material because the texture would just not work at that scale of the real material?
Right. Yeah. In the case of the concrete, I will not be using concrete. Um, because as you say, texture is a big issue, and getting that to look right in that scale is one very important thing. Another important issue is the longevity of a material like that. Uh, You know, as we look down our driveways or walk down a sidewalk, concrete is always cracked. It's kind of the nature of the beast. And here I would have to lay a really thin layer down, which is going to make it even more apt to suffer from temperature or vibration. Um, and it would be a struggle to do it in real concrete, you know. Whereas using some other materials, I may make the floor out of plastic, but I can duplicate the finish and the feel, and it'll be much more durable and really have that museum quality of longevity, so that in 50 years, when someone looks at this piece, there's not going to be cracks or problems in the finishes. Um, you know, there's these wonderful exposed beams in the home, and there I'm actually using real wood, and I've been working on the layers of stains to capture the feeling of the actual finishes that were applied to the beams. And I'd like to show you what that looks like. Okay, so I mentioned that there's these wonderful exposed beams in the ceiling of the Ball-Paylore home. And I first started by looking at different materials to replicate those beams. They are made out of Douglas fir, but so I bought some Douglas fir and I cut it to the appropriate size, but it just didn't look right. The scale of the grain, even though I went to an awesome lumber shop and was able to pick through, you know, dozens of boards. When I brought it home and I cut it, it just didn't look right. So I went to a different type of material, a wood with a finer grain, and I started to cut out these beams for the home. But they have this finish that this is a natural wood finish, and that's not what's going on in the actual home. They actually put a they call it a driftwood finish over the natural feeling of the beams. So what I did was I first stained, and I'll hold them up side by side so you can hopefully see the difference. But there was a couple layers of stain on this piece, and you can see the gray overcoat here. I actually put a light natural stain on it, and then I put this gray over the top, which muted the finish and grayed it out, because I remember the impression of that in the home. Looking up at those beams and seeing that washed out grayish look to the woodwork. And that was the natural and intended finish. That was not a product of aging. And I could see how that mirrors what happens on the outside of the home. There are some areas where there's sort of whitewashed or weathered brick out there, where the tones are taken down. And I can see that I think Mr. Brown had the same idea with the inside, to mute down the tones. So I'm experimenting right now, and it's a little hard to see on camera with true accuracy, but I think I've got a really nice finish developing here for what this can be like for the interior beams. That sort of muted, grayed out color to the wood. This is a wall section, and again, we can look at this in still images as well. But this is a scale brick pattern that I actually had to graft together to get the appropriate length. But then cut out of the top is the area where in both bedrooms, there's a series of wonderful, short, wide windows that go up between the rafters. So I have scaled those already, and I've created the window frame to scale already. I've made all 9 that I need for the structure. And those will sit up here along the top of the roof. And the beams actually go between them from the inside to the outside of the home. So I made all my windows to scale, then I cut little pieces of the beams and sandwiched them all together so that I could verify that I hit the right dimension as is called out in the blueprints for the 2-bedroom walls. So that's progressing beautifully. I'm really happy with the window frames. They're going to look like real aluminum when I get done with them. They'll have the glass in them, and they'll even have those windows pivot at the bottom. They pull down with that little ring that we've all used a million times in our life. that little ring's going to be on the miniature. It's going to be tiny, but it's the kind of stuff that really, people will relate to. It'll help them even to sense the scale. You know, things like that could help the mind uh, make the jump to how big this object really is. And to that point, here's a work in progress of the Studebaker that's going to sit out front of the place. This sits underneath the front carport. And again, having the Studebaker there under the carport at the front of the home is another great visual clue for people who aren't used to looking at architectural models, and most people aren't. This is kind of, these kind of things usually don't make their way out to the public eye, they're discussed internally in architectural firms and approved, and then a lot of times the models get tossed. For me, I've been careful to recreate some of this model and some of the base parts so that I can keep this model throughout the process. And it may even be something we might want to incorporate at least into the opening, perhaps, or initial presentation of the piece. I'm building it so that it could be put up on the wall potentially and make a wonderful additional part of the story as to how this piece came to be.
I love that. And I love that you're thinking about the longevity of the piece in terms of it being a museum piece, because so much of what we have in the museum was created for, because somebody wanted to do it or because they were making it for a patron.
Yes.
And there was never the intention to have it on display in a museum open to the public, 6 days a week from 9 to 4. And we are starting to see the impact of what that means. We regulate temperature and humidity in the museum. And when possible, we turn out the lights in the galleries to protect the miniatures. But anything that the artist can do to preserve the piece is really valuable to us as a museum so that people can enjoy it for perpetuity, really. I mean, we hope to be here indefinitely, and we hope that hundreds of years from now, people will still be able to enjoy the pieces in our museum. And it also made me think of my visit with Hank Kupchak. And when I was talking with him, he was really big on being thoughtful about the longevity of the pieces and the archival quality of the pieces. And I know you were friends with Hank, and that I believe he had some influence on you as you were developing as a miniaturist. So Hank Kupchak was the son of Eugene Kupchak, who created the miniature throne rooms at the Art Institute of Chicago. And of course, you're based in Chicago. And Hank is the person who maintained those miniatures for the museum, or worked with the curator to maintain those miniatures for the museum following his father's passing. And I had the pleasure of being able to meet Hank on a visit to Chicago. Unfortunately, he has passed away, and but you were fortunate to be a friend and have him as a mentor. So go ahead and share some of that with us.
Yeah, that was pretty fascinating. I was just thinking about, I was just starting to get into miniatures. I was just starting to build some things and feeling like, oh, this is something I should be doing. Little did I know that Hank Kupchak's studio was a block away from where my studio was. And it was hilarious. I never knew that. But I looked him up one day because I wanted to see if maybe I could do some work with him, for him, like behind the scenes kind of stuff. And we had an interesting conversation about that. He told me that, well, first he invited me in, never met me before, invited me in, gave me a full tour of his studio, and introduced me to his brother, and took me back into his archives, which was into the vault. And I saw some incredible pieces, some of which had never been in public view, others which were being rotated in and out of collections. There was a Spanish galleon that was an incredible thing. It was just the back half of a Spanish galleon, and it was the captain's quarters, and everything in there was handmade by Hank. The captain's table, all the navigational instruments, the files with maps in them. It was just an incredible tour de force um, piece of work, and but he openly shared with me everything, and we talked techniques. He didn't mind. He showed me how he made different things, and we had a wonderful visit. But he told me then too, and it's something that stuck with me. He says, he goes, you got the skills, and he goes, I'd like to see you pursue miniatures. He says, but he goes, when people contract me for a piece of work, they're hiring Hank Kupchak, and they want to know that everything that's been done there has been done by my hands. And I respected that totally. Even if I could do something that was up to his level and no one would ever know, it's not the point. They were paying for the, just the legend of Hank Kupchak to work on their pieces. And that's something that stuck with me. I try to be conscious of that in my work. I can very rarely bring in a freelancer to do anything. Maybe some pieces that I'm doing, maybe a small production run of a little detail thing that's going to. I do these little fireplace inserts that light up for a gentleman, and I can't mold them and cast them and decorate them for him. And that's something, those aren't my signature. That's not my signature work. But having it all be done by the artisan was something that I remembered hearing from Hank, and it's something that guides my work to this day. I remember one day after that visit, I stopped in to see him again, and I brought him my first completed miniature, which was this little Eames rocker, and it was the first piece that I had done that I was really kind of proud of, and I brought it over to show him, and it was wonderful. He hadn't done any vacuum forming before, which is how I make the shell for this seat, So I was able to share with him a little bit, and he was very encouraging. He really liked the piece, and it was a big shot in the arm for me too, to go ahead and keep following my passion and making my way and building my reputation little by little in this world of miniatures, because it takes time.
Yeah, awesome. What a great story. Yeah, I really enjoyed visiting with him, and he shared with me some pieces, wonderful pieces that I hope do get out into the public's eye now that he's passed. So, anyway, let's get back to the Ball-Paylor here a little bit.
Sure.
And so, since you work in small scale on a regular basis, I imagine that you move through a project like this, and at some point you might be working on it, and maybe you get distracted, maybe the phone rings, maybe you're preparing your dinner at the same time, and the timer goes off, and you have to stop. Well, let's say you have a slip of the hand, and you damage something,
Yeah.
and it's beyond repair. What does that feel like? How do you do you keep going? Do you stop and start another day?
I almost always work right through those things. I don't put it down. The only time I have to put it down is if that slip of the knife goes into my finger. And that happens. You're working really small. There's almost nothing to hold on to sometimes. And yeah, I cut up my fingers. And that's so annoying, because I think we all know that those things like to bleed, and I'll run it under the water, wrap some tape around it, but it keeps bleeding, and then I get blood on the work sometimes. I've had pieces of wood that I've been working on, and they get a blood stain on them. Bam, I got to throw them away, And it's not that that's a terribly painful wound or anything. It's just that it stops me dead in my tracks, because I have to wait till I can stop the bleeding to get back onto work. Other times, if I mess up a piece while I'm working on it, maybe it's a slip with the sander and, or a file or, like you say, one too many passes with a file can take too much off in the world that we work in. So then it's just put it down and make it again, and I learned that way. I've screwed up plenty of things, but I always learn from those mistakes and hopefully don't make them again. And it's part of what guides my process now too, in terms of using the right tool for the right job. I've got all my machines set up in my shop. Almost all of them that I use on a regular basis are out there and ready to use. So I'm not tempted to go ahead and do it some other some other way that just isn't the right way, but maybe I think it's going to be quicker. I don't do that anymore because invariably it always comes back to bite me. It doesn't come out right. It's not square. It's just not right for one reason or another. So now I take the time to do it right the first time, and in the long run it saves me. But yeah, I don't, if I screw something up, I go right back to it and figure it out. And usually, human error. So I make the adjustments and go right back at it.
I think that you just made a really good point too, that the right tool is really important. And that's something you gain with experience unless you happen to have somebody who, to reference, such as Hank Kupchak, for example, who you could say, hey, what tool is best for this? Because, yeah, otherwise you are kind of shooting in the dark. And at this point in your career, you have a lot of experiences, so you know probably pretty intuitively what tools to use for certain things. Do you find that it's pretty intuitive at a certain point?
Yes, yes. Because in the case of the Ball-Paylore home, right away when I looked at the blueprints, spent time in the house, I was looking at things uh, with those eyes. How am I going to make this? How am I going to make that? I think it's a thermidor. Or there's a wonderful built-in oven in that place. I'm looking at that, opened it up, looked at the materials. How am I going to fabricate that? So that so much of my time, the 2 days in that home, was looking at that structure with those eyes. That was a great place to be able to study materials and processes for me, and that really guided me, in terms of how to proceed, because those are some of the biggest questions to me. How am I going to make that? What's the appropriate material for this scale? And as you say, the museum quality and longevity of a piece, that's why cardboard mock-ups, they have no future. you know so yeah, and I have learned a ton of things over the years. I was trained as an industrial designer, and then I was a toy inventor for a dozen years, and that taught me tons. I had to problem solve every day, just kind of like today, but that kind of like I cut my teeth on problem solving because there were mechanisms or electronics, all these things, and I couldn't go to anybody to figure it out. The work is very confidential. And even back then, that was in the late 90s, into the 2000s. The internet was not as accessible either. So it was go to the library, read books about soldering techniques or gear ratios or mechanisms. It was a little bit, information was not as available as it is today. Now, thank goodness, if I want to just double check how to anneal, which means to soften like a piece of brass, I can go online and I can get some good tips and techniques there with the click of a button. But over the years, I've studied with some great people, and really the man who I look up to, and I think about him often, and I give him a call once in a while, and always look forward to seeing him and studying with him, is Mr. Bill Robertson. He's been a real mentor of mine. He encouraged me to follow through. I brought him, I showed him a piece like I did Hank Kupchak at the Chicago show. And he took me right over to Barbara Davis and said, Michael, you should sign up for the Guild and then you should apply for a scholarship to Castine. And so I just said, okay, kind of like that guy Davidson on Saturday Night Live. So I was just like, okay, okay, yeah, I'll do that. I met all these wonderful people, and yeah, Bill gave me the push over the edge. I did apply for a scholarship. I think I got one the second year I applied to Castine in Maine to learn and study. Almost every class I've taken there in Maine, I've studied with Bill Robertson because he's working with the machines, tools, techniques, and materials that I'm most connected with. So yeah, Bill Robertson's been a big influence on my career, and hats off to him. He's always willing to share, just the way Hank was, you know, someone who's beyond their ego and beyond any fear of anybody else of stealing ideas or anything. You know, it's like, here, if you really want to take this on, go ahead and try it, you know. And that's the attitude now that I try to carry on. You know, when I'm teaching, you know, it's like, boy, this stuff is really hard. And if you want to go ahead and try to outside of the class, maybe go ahead and try to reproduce one of the pieces, go ahead. Welcome to my world, because that world can be quite challenging sometimes, you know. But both of those guys, Hank and Bill, taught me to be open and share, because what I get back is many times what I give away.
Well, and I think that that shows their love and passion for miniatures as well, and the advancements of it. You know, I mean, if you're really passionate and love what you're doing, you want to see everyone do the best they can, and you can learn and grow from each other. So it's great to have mentors and people in the field that want to share and give. So that's awesome. And Bill is a great guy. I don't blame you for taking advantage of those opportunities. So Michael, you had to create scale drawings. You're building this 3D model, and it keeps coming up in our conversation that math is really an integral part of the development of a piece like this. Can you talk a little bit about your background in math, your comfort with math, um, the kinds of math that you are using to create this piece?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. When I was back in high school, I was good at math. I wasn't great, but I was taking AP courses, and I was really considering going into computer sciences. Okay, but the whole time I was doing that, I was in the art studio at school, drawing and painting and making things, and I still, when I was ready to graduate, it was like, but my real passion was with miniatures. But luckily, I had followed through with my math education, and I got a really good background. And it's something I use math every day. Um, and usually it's not very, what I would consider complicated, but it can get to be, okay? Um, and in the most basic sense, you know, we use math to determine scale, you know, and I that brings to mind your wonderful exhibit in the Mini Time Machine Museum that draws those real clear, powerful relationships between size and scale and what it means. You know, I think you guys did a really good job putting that together. And I think that's a really great way for people to begin to grasp what scale means relative to size. You know, you know, here, yeah, I use math all the time. I'm working with these drawings, and I had to figure out, okay, I've got to get 4 windows, and even though it's on the blueprint, but I've got to make it miniature. I've got to get 4 windows and 5 beams in between them to fit into a certain size space. How big does everything have to be? If I make all 4 windows and 5 beams the same size, What size do they have to be in order to fit in that space? So, that's and sometimes there's trial and error there. I'll make up some parts and they're just a little too big or they're a little too small. But maybe I have to make four of them and put them together to really see when I make those glue joints and cut those parts, if every one is a 32nd of an inch too big, by the time you put together four of those, the whole thing is an eighth of an inch too big. And in quarter-inch scale, that's 6 inches. Okay. So I would be off by that much in reality, which is totally unacceptable in terms of how someone would build a building, you know? Can you imagine walking down a flight of stairs and all of a sudden one of the stairs is twice as deep as it should be? You'd go flying. It can't be that way in the real world, and it shouldn't be that way in the miniature world either. And math comes in handy too with a project like the Ball-Paylore home. It's a hexagonal structure. So we don't have square rooms like we do in 99.9% of the houses and office buildings in the world. We're dealing with a form here, which by its nature has a variety of sort of complicated angles. And what complicates it even more is that when you try to put a slanted roof across a hexagon, you've got to make sure it hits at all the right points. There's a peak in the center, and then it's got that roof has to come down and hit the interior walls at the right point, the exterior walls, and then in this case, flow into the carport. So some of it, I'll start with a good estimation on what that angle should be because I've got some good accurate drawings, but inevitably things have to be tweaked a little bit because I'm not building it out of the same materials. My material may be slightly thicker or thinner in a structural way that's not going to show, but there is some trial and error in that too. But this is especially challenging being a hexagon. When you think about that, yeah, all these walls here, they're not straight across the top. They're on an angle, as you can see in the drawings back there. Everything is angled. So yeah, math is definitely a part of this, But in reviewing the math and building the maquette, the logic of the structure is revealed as well. And I think that's a fascinating part of building a maquette because it got my head. It took me the next level. Okay, I looked at the drawings, I stayed in the space, but then when I built the model, it took me to really the last level I felt I had to be at in terms of really understanding where Arthur T. Brown's head was at when he built this project. So the closer I can get to where he was, the more it all makes sense to me.
The more we talk about it, the more complex it becomes. As the casual viewer, you don't think about all those little itty bitty details in the same way. And there is so much to figure out here. I was also just thinking about the windows that you showed us earlier with the brick wall, and how when you're in the house, that type of wall allows some light into the space, but it minimizes the light so that it helps to support the solar, the passive solar design. It's also something that we kind of take for granted when we're standing in the house, and then when you're building it, you're talking about all the little things you have to consider. You realize just something that seems simple when you're standing in the space is actually really complex in terms of construction, and
right.
Especially on the miniature level. I didn't think either. I was also thinking to myself when you were talking just now about the glue impacting the joints and the scale. Do you have to factor in a certain amount of, I guess, space for things like glue?
Yeah, tolerances, Not so much for adhesives, um, more so for painted finishes,
Mm.
because as you start adding up layers of paint to an object, even if it's a little piece like this, you're adding dimension to it. And when you do that over 4 or 5 windows, you know, again, it starts to add up. So I have to be cognizant of of the thicknesses and layers of paint. I want it to be substantial. I want it to last. I want it to portray the right kind of finish. But I also, that's why so much of what I do in terms of paint application is done with the airbrush, because it allows me to control really fine layers of paint. And unlike brush painting, and I know you with your fine artist background, I know, building up layer and texture is something you can do with paint. In my case, it's rarely something I want to do. Sometimes I do work to recreate a textured surface, but basically it's about minimizing the thickness of the paint, and using an airbrush is one way that really helps me control really fine levels of paint application that way.
I didn't think about it before, but yeah, when you're, especially when you're working in mid-century, so many of those surfaces are really clean and smooth and shiny and simple. So any kind of
Mm,
distraction from the painted surface would be glaring.
you're
So
right.
I
That's what,
definitely.
that's kind of the Zen beauty quality of mid-century modern work. It is, it's so spare by nature, but every detail matters. And any type of flaw in the finish, your eye's going to go there immediately, or in the way that a frame is made up. People look at this type of stuff and sometimes and they say, "Oh my gosh, it's so simple." And yes, it is, but it's not simple to make because every minute detail matters so much. It's kind of a blessing and a curse of working in mid-century.
So Michael, you are going to be challenged to create that old Thermador stove and an oven, and there's also the old refrigerator in the kitchen as well. But I do know that you've been working on some kitchen appliances recently. Can you talk a little bit about some things you've learned from those kitchen appliances that you may be able to apply to these older models that you were observing in the Ball-Paylor house?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm developing a contemporary kitchen for a client, and so I had to move out of my usual mid-century era, which I love to do. I love all eras of good design, I would say. But so I developed a contemporary Wolf stove and a Sub-Zero refrigerator, um, and with a lot of working features. The 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 Wolf stove has opening. It's got two ovens, so both ovens open. They have oven racks on the inside, which are all hand soldered thin brass wire. They're removable. The oven cavities light up. Um, on the top of the stove, all the burners have been faithfully replicated, as well as the grates that fit over them. There's a lot of really great detail in the design work that companies like Wolf and Sub-Zero do, and it's a pleasure to reproduce because it is such good high end design. Yeah, the refrigerator is really it's all metal. The doors open. It's got real glass shelves and adjustable racks, and it lights up. It was a real one of the most challenging things I've ever done, but very gratifying as well. But it gave me insights into working on appliances, what the elements are, what's important, what shows the most, what the features are that people are going to relate to. And so, in looking at the vintage appliances, their forms are so different from what we're living with today. The nice softness of them and the asperity, they're incredibly especially the ones in the Ball-Paylore home, are really well designed. So I, again, as I was looking at them and eating in the kitchen, I was thinking, how am I going to make those? And they're most likely going to be made of metal, like the real thing, and they'll capture all the softness and curves of those shapes that were popular in the era. The refrigerator, as you is a period piece as well. So that has all those wonderful soft contours of like a 1940s. I think it's a GE refrigerator, and I've wanted to develop a whole kitchen suite based on the style of that refrigerator. So I think this is when I go ahead and develop this piece and I do the research and study it. Of course, it'll be in 1/24 scale, half-inch scale for the miniature, but it's something that I want to go ahead and reproduce later on and develop a whole kitchen, 1940s, 50s kitchen based on those style of appliances, because they're so charming. And I can see especially when I'm doing shows, there's certain things that people really have that attachment to. We've all gone to the refrigerator so many times in our lives. And a lot of us grew up, if we're old enough, we grew up with a refrigerator like that might have been hanging around the house for all those years, or maybe made its way into the basement later on, But there's that visceral kind of connection. And that reminds me of another thing that I'd like to show you that is a great example, I think, of the visceral connection. Okay. We talk about that visceral connection though, and this piece right here, this chaise lounge that I do in, this is 1/12 scale. This is our more normal dollhouse scale, but it's all made out of aluminum, just like the real thing. But this makes that visceral connection with people, where they remember the backs of their thighs being cut by the straps. They remember when the straps have broken and they've fallen through the piece. Everybody comes to me with a story, from their childhood, or even now, they still make these aluminum folding chairs and things. But it makes a visceral connection with people. It's been one of the most popular pieces I've done, the folding chair and the chaise lounge, because people can relate to it instantly in good and bad ways.
Right. I think of my thighs sweating and sticking to those straps.
Absolutely. And then Dad trying to replace them.
That too.
Was another. It's like, throw it out. Let's get a new one.
True. And then you have those really interesting, heavy old 50s lounge chairs that are on the patio of the Ball-Paylore to deal with.
Yes. I really love those. They are, like all the furnishings, they are touchstones of a point in history. And whether you lived it, or whether you've studied about it, or whether you come in totally naive and are captivated by those designs, that's another really great point to this miniature. It's like a time capsule. The house has remained a time capsule, which is just fabulous. It hasn't been remodeled, modernized. It's still in its original form, and that's so valuable. And for me to see and study, for future generations to be able to admire, and for me to really get a clear vision of what it was really like to translate into our miniature, make it really a time capsule.
Yeah. And I love that. I mean, we're the mini time machine because our founder thought of miniatures that way, that, they capture a moment in time, and you can see multiple different times as you start to collect them and put them next to each other.
Yes.
And, here, one of the reasons we're interested in sharing the Ball-Paylore house with the Tucson community, and why we wanted to commission this piece, is we have a few adobe houses, which harken back to very old years, and that style still remains popular, though the construction has changed. They're usually framed and faux, not adobe brick anymore, but advances in technology and materials for this region have changed and grown. And so the passive solar quality of this house and how it's impacted future designers and future technology and architecture for the Southwest make it a significant piece. And then it's just beautifully designed, and it shows the importance of modern architecture in the desert Southwest, just like it was, popular all across the country.
You bring up some good points, though, and the Arthur Brown in his studies into passive solar treatments in architectural projects he was really at the forefront of what now is something that's a part of daily discussion in all, with people's increased awareness of resources and energy conservation and such. He was right there at the sharp end of considering some of these things and putting them into practice, and actually being able to sell his clients on the fact that he thought this was a good idea and they should do this. In the case of the Ball-Paylore home, we've got those revolving solar shades on the back patio and on the southern face of the building. And the southern face, if I can just get up here and show you in relation to the model, this is the part of the model that faces south, these 3 glass walls. And so I'm going to put the roof back on for a second. We can see here that, he deliberately left the roof line back so that in the cooler seasons of the year, there could be maximum light let into the structure and warmth. And not only through the windows, but on this poured concrete slab. So the concrete slab, which extends, as I said, into the interior of the residence, is going to absorb heat all day. So when the temperature's cool, you've got this pad that's been heated all day and brings and absorbs that thermal energy and continues to warm the house into the evenings, which is, we know, can be quite cool in the desert Southwest. But the passive solar shades are adjustable on the house, and in quite an easy manner. They're made out of lightweight materials on the real house, and they're basically a metal framework that has a corrugated roof on it in the actual finished piece, but they're lightweight, and these shades pivot right around the outside of the building, so that in the summertime, when the heat levels are up and you want some shade, the ladies were able to go out there and just push these panels along. They were, like as I mentioned, they were on wheels, they were on casters. So there were no electric motors necessary, nothing to break down. Mr. Brown kept it very simple. And so even women like Ms. Ball and Ms. Paylor, who were rather slight of stature, could go out in the backyard and move these panels around to give themselves additional shade in the summer or additional sun in the winter. So it was very clever, direct, simple solution to the problem. Sophisticated, but simple. The architect Arthur T. Brown, he, as well as some of the features we've discussed with the revolving panels and the thin, narrow windows, he also carefully chose the external colors for the structure so that they would, again, influence the heating, the passive heat retention or cooling of the total structure. And you see this on the color choices for the interior walls and exterior surfaces. There's some deep warm tones in the interior bedrooms to give them a sense of intimacy and create a warmth there. And they do have large patio windows at the back of each bedroom. So they worked as well. These warmer, deeper colors did absorb light and heat as well. So he was thinking about how the actual building itself, the brick material, could be used as another element in passive heating and cooling of the structure. He developed a really wonderful palette of colors. And as one of my next steps here, most of these finishes are on brick. And so I will be utilizing samples of the eventual brickwork that I'll be using, and I'll be doing my color tests right on the brickwork. This brick has to be grouted first. I will hand grout the brick, and then apply the different finishes for the different rooms and do color tests and samples myself to verify those final color choices and develop the formulas for them before I paint the miniature. And this is another area too where it's not always about reproducing the exact color. You know, this is where that artistic eye comes in a little bit, where it's got to look right, it's got to feel right, and we're viewing this model too from from an angle, looking down into the rooms. We're going to naturally see some things from different viewing angles than one would if one were living, we're inside the house and looking at the walls. So we're going to get different reflections. Colors are going to appear differently when we're looking at the structure from the bird's eye view. So there will probably be some little tweaks to the colors to make them read, as I like to call it. So they read correct, they feel right, even though they may be just a tad darker or lighter or warmer or cooler than the original tone. They'll read right. They'll have the right feeling and capture the spirit of the palette of the original home.
It's interesting when you're dealing with miniatures, you definitely have to pay attention to the subtleties that bring the whole picture together. Because if you don't, you won't convey the feeling, and it won't feel real. It'll feel like a toy, potentially.
Right. It's not just about shrinking something. It's really about capturing the essence of it.
Yeah, that's perfect. Again, capturing the essence.
Yeah, and putting it all together, having the drawings, the maquette, and really, most importantly for me, the lived-in experience of having been able to spend 2 days and nights in that home. That was really special, and that goes a long way towards me. That was unforgettable, and there's a 1,200 square foot house. The tiny house movement is so big these days. This house is 1,200 square feet. That's the exact size of my home studio. It's crazy. So I can relate, but the way that space is laid out is so sophisticated and open and blends the inside with the outside. It's just brilliant.
So Michael, you got the paper model started. We've talked about a lot of things that you've been working on, and you've shown us a couple and indicated a couple of next steps. Can you tell us what really is, let's call it phase 2. If this is phase 1, what's phase 2? Where are you going next with the project?
Well, phase 2, I've already begun to move into. It's been a matter of sourcing the correct materials that are going to look right in scale. That's included experimenting and failing and finally succeeding with some of the woods and combinations of finishes to get the right kind of feel and look to like the wood beams, like we talked about. The brickwork, and getting the appropriate, I was able to get the appropriate scale of brick in a commercially available product, but it takes a lot of manipulation to get it to form the hexagon, because these commercially available materials were meant to build square structures, and we're dealing with a hexagon. So there's some R&D that's going to go into making all the joinery and things work out in our scale. There's the color palette, which we've discussed a little bit, and making sure that I come up with the correct choice of colors. And I'll be doing that in terms of like swatches, almost like you would view, like they did probably when they were developing the project at the beginning. Here, my endpoint. It's not so amorphic. You know, we know where we want to be, but again, it's going to be not simply painting what's on the color chart uh, onto the walls, but to make sure that it translates well into the size and scale that we're working with. So I'll be working with color. I'll also be working on the foundation to go ahead and lay the foundation, literally. The whole place was built on a slab, but there's some grade changes that happen around the outside of the home. They're subtle, but they're meaningful. The brick does not go down to the base of the house all the way around the house. Some of the concrete slab is exposed. So I've already been working on what will be the final platform, the final foundation for the whole piece that will replicate that concrete slab. And because that slab is so important, it defines the hexagonal shape of the piece, but it's also critical in creating the semicircular area that creates the south face of the building. And there too, I'll be working with polished concrete versus more raw, unfinished concrete, and developing the track, the solar shades. They revolve around on a track that's been cleverly built into the perimeter of this patio. So I'm going to be developing all those types of details that relate to the foundation, and then as well as building up actual walls, windows, and then figuring out another thing I'm working with, and I think it's going to be really exciting. But with the removable roof, it's like what's going to stay, what parts are going to stay attached to the lower building, and what's going to rise with the roof. And my thinking at this point is that I believe that we're going to have all these beams that are going to run across the roof. They're fairly generously, there's quite a bit of space between them. My gut feeling tells me that these beams have to go through the brickwork and out to the outside of the building. So I'm thinking that what I'm going to do is to leave the beams in place with the base structure, and then when the roof is raised, you'll see after on top of the beams, there's a lot of little wooden slats. Those will rise with the roof, but these beams will stay down on this level. And I think that will really help create the illusion and the sense of space. If you don't have a roof, we're not used to living in spaces without roofs, you know? So I think these beams are going to be a really nice, subtle, and sophisticated way to create and suggest the roof without actually moving.
Well, it has been so wonderful to be able to come into your studio today and learn about how you get started on this project and see how it's progressing, and to also see a few other little details. Thank you so much for inviting us in.
Well, you're welcome, Lisa, and a big thank you to everyone at your museum there who's been involved in the project, from creating the website and promotional materials and helping me with reference materials. I mean, your staff has just been terrific to work with, and I really appreciate that. It's a real partnership, and it's magnified by the distance we're working apart, but it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel like we're 1,000 miles apart, it feels like we're on the same page. So I'm really grateful to be working on this commission. It's a dream job for me. It's if I could pick any building in the country to do, this would be in the top 5. This is really right up there with some of the architectural masterpieces that we've got in this country. So I'm honored that you chose me to take on the project, and I'm committed to doing a really great piece for you all.